All right, anybody tracking the Mazzaroth? When did Sagittarius start? What's that? In the beginning. That's right.
The new moon something.
I was
Yeah.
going to say, we looked at the new moon last night, and I said that, and Joe said that doesn't always equate to the...
Yeah, so remember
The sun.
when we did Hanukkah, I said that you can't actually see the new moon. That by the time you
Right.
see that first sliver, the new moon has
Yeah.
already happened, right? So actually it was Wednesday.
Oh, it's yeah.
Wednesday was the first day when the sun rose in the Mazzaroth sign of Sagittarius. It's just left Scorpio, and what that means is that now we transition in the story of God away from Scorpio and Kadesh Barnea and the sting of God's rejection, and we start talking about the story of Joshua and the conquering of the Promised Land. This is actually what the sky looked like a few hours after sunrise. Actually, it kind of looked like this morning, but over the last couple of days, and I went a few hours after sunrise just so that you can see Scorpio. You can see, I'm sorry, not Scorpio, but Sagittarius. And Sagittarius is the archer. And depending on which image you're looking at, in this one in particular, what they call the constellation art in this astronomy program, they picture him as what's commonly called a satyr, which is a man, like the body of a man, but, or the torso and head of a man, but the body of a horse. But some of the other kind of ancient and other culture pictures just has a man who's, just simply an archer. The story of Joshua and the story of his success and his victories as he brought the Jews into the Promised Land, in my mind, actually begins with the failure of Moses. And we'll explain that as we continue going on, but it kind of culminates. We had the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, which certainly was not without drama, right? That wasn't just walking around for 40 years. A lot of stuff happened in that period of time. But that period of time ended with some things that Moses did wrong. So before we actually get into the story of Moses in the Promised Land, I want to take a look at some of the mistakes that Moses made during the time that they wandered. And I also want to remind you that what we've seen about Moses so far in terms of his personality and his character, he was very humble. He was a very obedient man. He was hungry and he was thirsty for God's presence. Remember when he begged God, he said, "Let me see your glory." And God said, "No, because it'll kill you." He was also righteously angry, and he was very protective over God. And he was protective over Aaron. He was protective of the sanctity of the priesthood. He repeatedly interceded not just for the nation, but also like Korah, the people that rebelled against him specifically, right? And also against Aaron. But that doesn't mean that Moses was perfect, right? Go to Numbers chapter 20. Now just to give some context here, this is after Korah's rebellion. It's after the plague that killed about 15,000 rebellious people. It's after God had ratified both Moses and Aaron as his chosen prophet and high priest. And it was also after God had promised Aaron that the rest of the Levites would serve him and his son, or his sons, in temple worship. What chapter did I tell you to go to? 20. Hang on. Actually, let's go back to Numbers 14. I think I wrote my reference down incorrectly. Numbers 14, verse 1. Then the children of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed in Kadesh, and Miriam died there and was buried there. Now there was...
Wait a minute.
No, that was 20.
Okay, that is 20. Okay, so I wrote... Sorry, my apologies. I've got it noted here as Numbers 14, but my reference was right, but my notes were wrong.
Yeah.
All right, let me start over. Numbers 20, verse 1. Then the children of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed in Kadesh, and Miriam died there and was buried there. Now there was no water for the congregation. Here we go again, right? There was no water for the congregation, so they gathered together against Moses and Aaron, and the people contended with Moses and spoke, saying, "If only we died when our brethren died before the Lord. Why have you brought us Why have you brought up the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, that we and our enemies or animals should die here? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is not a place of grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, nor is there any water to drink. Same old story. So Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the door of the tabernacle of meeting, and they fell on their faces. And the glory of the Lord appeared to them. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, take the rod, and the language actually has the definite articles, right? So it's talking about the staff of Moses, which at some point was actually called the rod of God. We've seen that in at least one other reference. So he says, take the rod, you and your brother Aaron, gather the congregation together, speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water. Thus you shall bring water for them out of the rock and give drink to the congregation and their animals. Now this is a different story than what we saw in the beginning of their time when they came out of Egypt. Because remember, there's 2 or 3 other times where they complained about water and God miraculously provided water. So Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he commanded him, and Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, hear now, you rebels, must we bring water to you out of this rock? Yes. Then Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their animals drank. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe me to hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. This was the water of Meribah, because the children of Israel contended with the Lord, and he was hallowed among them. That word Meribah means contention. It's called the water of contention. So mistake, right? What was Moses' mistake here?
Struck the rock.
Struck instead of?
Spoke,
right? He was told to speak to the rock, but he didn't do that. Now, why do you think Moses disobeyed God?
He'd had enough.
Had enough with God?
No, the people.
Had enough with the people. So why would he disobey God? Because he was frustrated with the people.
He probably didn't realize what he was doing at the time.
Okay.
Sometimes you just react.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just react.
Mm-hmm.
Does the Bible explain why? I don't see any explanation in the local context, right?
But God said, because you believed me not, to sanctify me in the eyes of the children
Right.
of Israel.
I mean, think about it. If he spoke to the rock, that shows, I would think, more power than striking it. You know, you say struck the rock, oh, it just loosened it up, and so the water started coming out.
But if God had said strike the rock and he struck the rock, would that not be equally as powerful as speaking to the rock?
Would be. We clearly disobeyed
Yeah.
God.
So here's the truth. It's all speculation. We have no idea. But let me share a few things. You remember a little while ago we talked about the Talmud. The Talmud is it's got 2 parts to it. It's got the Mishnah, which is the written version of the oral tradition, the oral Torah, and then the other part is called the Gemara, which is the rabbinical commentary on the Mishnah. Right. So for many generations, the Jews just handed down all their stories and all their laws and commandments through oral tradition, and then after Christ, this is actually after the resurrection, quite a long ways after. Actually, somebody started to write down. I think it was around 200 in the 3rd century, somewhere around there. And then many years later, rabbis started commenting on the written versions of the oral Torah. But also remember that at some point the Levitical system gave way to rabbinical Judaism. Right after the temple was destroyed, there was no priesthood, and then came the generation of these rabbis. So basically, the Talmud is essentially a rabbinical commentary on the oral tradition, but it dates to the beginning of this kind of tradition dates to 100 or more years after Christ, and a lot of the Gemara, a lot of the commentary was written in the Middle Ages, right? So we're talking about some relatively recent, not quite so old. So I want to show you a couple of things here. In the Gemara, a rabbi named Yoshe said this. He said about this story specifically, he said 3 good sustainers rose up for the Jewish people during the Exodus from Egypt, and they are Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. and 3 good gifts were given from heaven through their agency. And these are they: the well of water, the pillar of cloud, and the manna. And he elaborates. The well was given to the Jewish people in the merit of Miriam. The pillar of cloud was in the merit of Aaron, and the manna in the merit of Moses. When Miriam died, the well disappeared, as is stated, and Miriam died there, and it says thereafter in the next verse, there was no water for the congregation. But the well returned in the merit of both Moses and Aaron. And then another rabbi named Rabbi Rashi, who was from the 12th century after Christ, he just appears to make stuff up. He really does. And he provides details that are not recorded in the Bible. He says that Moses intended to speak to the rock, but it rolled away. And it landed with a whole bunch of other rocks, and he didn't know what rock he was supposed to speak to. And he tried to speak to the rock, but he spoke to the wrong one, and it didn't work. And the people ridiculed him and made fun of him. So he got angry, and remembering that in the past he had struck the rock with his rod, he did it again and hit it twice just for good measure, and then the water came out.
How do you know which rock?
Yeah.
That's a good
I was
point.
thinking maybe he had like a, what is it, like
Divining rod.
no, what is that, like a scythe?
Like a scythe?
Yeah, and just,
Yeah.
just like hit them all at the same time.
And my point in bringing this up wasn't to go, oh, the Talmud says this, so this is actually what happened. It's just to show how ridiculous it is when people fill in the holes of things that are not stated. Now, I think there are some cases where we can speculate and conjecture, and I think if we're intellectually honest and say this is what we're doing, we're speculating, I think we're okay to do that, as long as we're not being outlandish, right? I think there are some things we just have to reach a little bit to maybe fill in some details, but we have to be clear that that's what we're doing, right? And certainly not go, thus saith the Lord. Skip down to Numbers 20, verse 22. Aaron dies not long after this particular story. Numbers 20:22. Now the children of Israel, the whole congregation, journeyed from Kadesh and came to Mount Hor. And Mount Hor is, you can see it on the screen there, it's just south of the Dead Sea, about 60 miles south of that. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in Mount Hor by the border of the land of Edom, saying, Aaron shall be gathered to his people. That's a euphemism for he's going to die and be buried. For he shall not enter the land which I have given to the children of Israel, because you rebelled against my word at the water of Meribah. Take Aaron and Eleazar his son, and bring them up to Mount Hor, and strip Aaron of his garments, and put them on Eleazar his son, for Aaron shall be gathered to his people and die there. So Moses did just as the Lord commanded, and they went up to Mount Hor in the sight of all the congregation. Moses stripped Aaron of his garments and put them on Eleazar his son, and Aaron died there on the top of the mountain. Then Moses and Eleazar came down from the mountain. Now when all the congregation saw that Aaron was dead, all the house of Israel mourned for Aaron for 30 days. Now it kind of sounds harsh when it says Moses stripped Aaron of his garments. Kind of sounds harsh, sounds like a punishment, right? I don't know that that's true. I mean, what do you guys think? Do you think it's a punishment?
No,
What do you think?
I just think it's the way they describe that. I think he just meant take his garments that are
Yes.
priestly garments and give those garments to someone else.
Yeah, and the word, both in the Hebrew and the Greek, just simply means to disrobe, just to take stuff
Do we
off.
know how
right?
he died?
Acute lack of life. Yeah, I don't know. I
You
don't
said
think
the
it
garments
says.
if it was cold.
Hypothermia.
Yeah, hypothermia. They
Hypothermia
just
because they
abandoned
stripped him
him
of
up
his
there.
garments.
Yeah, maybe that's what it was.
It's in a mountain.
Yeah. You know, but here's like, I don't think the punishment obviously was dying and not going into the promised land, right? So being stripped of his garments was just simply part of the transfer of office and authority, if you will. But it sure seems to me like God is tying up some loose ends, right? First of all, Miriam died. Now Aaron. Who's next? Moses, right? Go to chapter 21. We're going to hear just in a second about the king of Arad. Arad was a Canaanite king. And this guy Arad wages war on them, and he defeats the Jews initially, and then he takes a whole bunch of people captive. And then the Jews pray to God for victory, and he helps them. And then they defeat him, they get their people back, and then they continue to wander throughout the desert. And of course, what do you think they do again? Right after they lose people, and then they beat the guy, and they get their people back. So in verse 4, 21 verse 4, then they journeyed from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom. And the soul of the people became very discouraged along the way. And the people spoke against God. And again, against Moses, why have you brought us up out of Egypt? I mean, it's almost comical at this point, isn't it?
Yes.
Why have you brought us out of Egypt to die in this wilderness? Now, the people that are saying this, are these the ones who actually came out of Egypt?
No.
Maybe some of them were like the 2-year-old that grew up and is now 42 years old. But this is towards the end of the wandering. Right? This is pretty close to the time, if not right around the time where... Well, actually, no, I'm sorry. It is. It's after the 40 years because we've already seen Kadesh Barnea, right? So this is the generation where none of the original people who came out of Egypt would have been alive, at least the adults. So basically, they say again, for there is no food and no water, and our soul loathes this worthless bread, this manna. So the Lord sent fiery serpents, and depending on what your translation is, that word fiery just means poisonous. The Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and many of the people of Israel died. Therefore the people came to Moses and said, "Oh, we have sinned, for we've spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he take away the serpents from us." And so Moses did, because that's the kind of guy he is, right? And that was his job. It was to intercede between God and the people. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and it shall be that everyone who is bitten, when he looks at it, shall live." So Moses made a bronze serpent, put it on a pole, and so it was. If a serpent had bitten anyone, when he looked at the bronze serpent, he lived. Now, Paul talks about this, and we'll go to the New Testament, go to 1 Corinthians 10 just for a second. Just want to show you some stuff here. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 1. "Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud." Now he's talking about the history of the Jews and how they had these common experiences, but they continued to fail and rebel. I don't want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea. And this is a reference to coming out of Egypt and having the Red Sea part. "All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All ate the same spiritual food." He's referring to manna. "And all drank the same spiritual drink." He's talking about the water that was miraculously supplied. "For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ." And this basically recognizing that all the miraculous provision throughout all those generations came directly from the pre-existing Christ. "But with most of them, God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness." And that's the generation that rejected him at Kadesh Barnea. "Now these things became our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted, and do not become idolaters as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play." What's that a reference to?
No.
Down at the mountain when Moses was getting the 10 Commandments.
Yeah, the golden calf, right? When Aaron took all the gold and made the golden calf. "Nor let us commit sexual immorality as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents." Now, what does he mean? And so obviously he's referring back to this incident where they complained and then God sent the poisonous snakes. But Paul says, he says that was tempting Christ. How do we reconcile the terminology? Like, we look at temptation as, somebody today brought chocolate cookies out there and I'm not supposed to eat them, and I did. I was tempted and I gave in. Is that the kind of tempting that we do, or
It's
that
more of a test? You're testing.
Maybe
Testing.
they were pushing the button.
pushing the buttons?
Pushing the envelope.
It was a button that had a divot in it because it's been hit so many times, right? And yeah, it's just this constant tempting his patience and the challenging his authority. Verse 10, "Nor complain as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now, all of these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition. This is a great verse to challenge anybody who's a New Testament believer that doesn't think that there's any relevance. The Old Testament has nothing, no value to us as modern day Christians, right? All these things happened to them as examples. They were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you, such as is common to man. And this is, going back to what we were saying about the song, right? Thank you for the scars and all the bumps and bruises of life. There's nothing that any of us can go through that is unique and special because someone else has already gone through it.
Amen.
Right? Everyone's gone through stuff. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear up underneath it. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. Now, he gives us this really long list, right? Kind of a catalog of all the mistakes that these earlier generations of Israelites made. And he ends this section where he says, flee from idolatry. Does anybody know what happened to Moses' staff? The one that he put the serpent on and held up, and when people looked at it, they got healed. What happened to his staff? Anybody know? You know? Go ahead.
It was kept, and it actually became a figure of worship for some people, and then it was destroyed because of that.
Go to 2 Kings chapter 18.
I guess I got a staph infection.
Staph infection, please.
Oh.
Grown.
No kidding.
2 Kings 1, I'm sorry.
That's so bad I'm going to edit it out of the video. 2 Kings 18. 2 Kings 18. And if you want to look at these things on your own, there's actually more details in 2 Chronicles chapters 29 to 32 gives a little bit more detail. But in 2 Kings 18 verse 1, Hezekiah was king. He was one of the last good kings of Judah before the Babylonian captivity. So verse 1 says this, Now it came to pass in the 3rd year of Hoshea, the son of Elah, king of Israel, that Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he became king. And he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abi, the daughter of Zechariah. And he did what was right in the sight of the Lord. And that's a phrase that's used throughout Kings and Chronicles for the good kings of Judah that rose up and undid all the damage that the previous bad kings had done. And typically it was destroying pagan temples and trying to restore national worship back to Jehovah. So he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father David had done. He removed the high places and broke the sacred pillars, cut down the wooden image, and broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made, for until those days the children of Israel burned incense to it and called it Nehushtan. He trusted in the Lord God of Israel, so that after him was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor were there before him. And this word Nehushtan has some variable meanings, but the sense is to strike down with your hand, so like to deliver a blow. Very interesting, right? That amazing event that happened in their history, they turned it into idol worship, which is, thou shalt have, like the first couple of commandments, thou shalt have no other God before me, and thou shalt not make any graven image for the purpose of worship. Very interesting. Jump back to Numbers for me again. Go to Numbers 25. Let me give you a summary of Numbers chapter 21 to 25. Those 5 chapters show Israel in various battles. They capture entire cities. They defeat Og of Bashan. Then King Balak of Moab, and actually wasn't very long ago. I can't remember if I went through it or Tim did. I think Tim did. Talked about how Balaam the prophet, King Balak of Moab, basically contracted with this guy Balaam, who was a prophet, and he wanted him to curse Israel because he wanted to go up against Israel in war. And he figured, well, I'll get this prophet to speak and curse them, and that way I'm going to be able to defeat them. But every time Balaam went to speak, instead of speaking curses, he actually blessed Israel. And it happened several times, and finally Balak got a little bit tired of it. But that was God speaking through Balaam and not Balaam itself, because if you remember, we see in Numbers 25 here, we'll see it in a second, but also we see later in Revelation chapter 2 that Balaam, left to his own devices, betrayed Israel. Right? God spoke against him in the 7 letters, specifically it's the church of Pergamos, I believe, and he said, you have people in your church that follow the doctrine of Balaam, who have been taught to eat food sacrificed to idols and commit sexual immorality within the church, right? So Numbers 25 verse 1. And this is again after they've gone through several battles, they've captured cities, they've won these great military victories. Now Israel remained in the acacia grove, and the people began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. They invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to them. So Israel was joined to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was roused against Israel. Then the Lord said to Moses, take all the leaders of the people and hang the offenders before the Lord out in the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. And so, I mean, you guys see the pattern, right? It's the constant griping and complaining, and it's the same old story. And they really mess up, and God gets really angry, and a bunch of people die because of their infidelity and the disobedience. And Moses and Aaron continue to intercede, and then God relents, and then it all happens again. All happens again. Verse 6. And indeed, verse 5. So Moses said to the judges of Israel, every one of you kill his men who were joined to Baal of Peor. And indeed, one of the children of Israel came and presented to his brethren a Midianite woman in the sight of Moses and in the sight of all the congregation of the children of Israel, who were weeping at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. Now when Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the high priest, saw it, he rose from among the congregation and took a javelin in his hand. The Septuagint calls it a barbed spear, right? Kind of like one of those ferocious looking ancient weapons. And he went after the man of Israel into the tent and thrust both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman through her body. So the plague was stopped among the children of Israel. And those who died in the plague were 24,000 people. Now the Septuagint says that she was pierced through her womb. Why do you think that's significant?
She was probably pregnant. She's going to kill the child too. Nothing, no seed of her would ever come out.
Yeah. So did she have to be pregnant for that to be a significant thing?
Or just to show that, I don't know.
That could be symbolic too, right?
Symbolic of that,
Yeah. Why was it wrong for this man to bring a Midianite woman into the camp?
God told him not to mix with the people.
True.
Usually in the battles, he told them to kill all the people
Yeah.
and obliterate them and not bring them in.
Yeah. But what was, I mean, I think we're given the details in this story for very specific reasons, like she was pierced through her womb. I think that's significant for either the reason Walter stated, she was either pregnant, or it was symbolic because a Jew, an Israelite, was having intercourse with a pagan woman, right? And they were told to not do that. But why does it say, if you go back, let me just get the verse here. It says in verse 6, he brought the Midianite woman in the sight of Moses, in the sight of all the congregation of Israel.
Bold.
What's that?
That was bold.
Bold for sure. But what would happen? Who would God hold accountable if the guy was just having intercourse outside of the camp and nobody knew about it?
Oh,
Who would he hold accountable? And who does he hold accountable if the guy walked into the camp and made it clear to all the leaders that that's what was going on and they didn't do anything about it?
Moses and all the leaders.
Yeah, and I think that's why this section starts when God says, take all the leaders of the people and hang the offenders. I mean, this was just as much a test of leadership as it was enforcing the law. Does that make sense? Were you going to say something, or is that a light bulb?
It seems similar to Ezekiel. It almost seems like they were doing sun worship and they were weeping before the door of the tabernacle of the congregation.
I didn't read it that way.
I might be way off.
But he's spelling out is why do you specify, at all the congregation of the children of Israel who were weeping at the door of the tabernacle, meaning why were they weeping at the door of the tabernacle?
Yeah, I've read that, and a lot of the commentaries mention that those are people who are kind of like the people in Ezekiel's day, the one who are weeping and mourning and sighing over the abominations that were happening.
Oh, okay, that would be different.
Right, because it wasn't this just one thing. It was God was exacting retribution now for thousands of people who had been joined with the Midianites and the Moabites.
Their backs weren't towards the door; they were.
Yeah, they were. I think they were pleading with the Lord, and the fact that they were at the entrance to the tabernacle of the meeting implies that they were respectful and they weren't going in, right? Because they were told only the Levites could actually go in there.
So, in one respect, maybe we can look at this as where it's saying we were weeping at the door of the tabernacle because they were mourning for righteousness, for justice to be done.
I believe so.
And so, therefore, it's kind of like saying they were weeping here, but justice was done before them, so it would show an answer to their prayers.
Yeah, and it was a specific man, right? It was Phinehas, the priest, and so here's a couple of things to think about. First of all, I think the point of showing that this man brought the Midianite woman into the midst of the camp and the leadership, including Moses, saw it, implies that if something wasn't done, if the law wasn't enforced, that God was going to hold everybody accountable, which is why when Phinehas acted, God said this in verse 10, Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the high priest, has turned back my wrath from the children of Israel because he was zealous with my zeal among them, so that I did not consume the children of Israel in my zeal. He didn't say, so I didn't consume the people who went out and had sex with the Midianites and the Moabites. He said the children of Israel. He's talking about the entire congregation, right? Because until somebody in the leadership acted and said, I will enforce the will of God, he was ready to hold the entire nation accountable for the sins of that one person. It wasn't really the one person, but it was that much more of an insult to God because he brought this woman into the congregation. But the moment that the entire leadership knew about it, everybody was accountable. Does that make sense? And that kind of sounds a little bit, if you go back to the lessons we talked about when we talked about preserving the sanctity of the fellowship, right? What is it that we allow into our midst, right? And we always have to strike that balance between evangelizing and creating opportunity for people to come and to visit and to interact with us and to learn about God. But there are certain times like the festivals and the feast days where I believe that that's holy. And that's got to be, kind of kept within the family, if you will.
That kind of also, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
Kind of makes sense whenever we went over it before as far as like the church itself and how the breath of God is important in understanding the concept of that and how we are all, like the presence of God is here with us in a sense when we are all holding each other accountable and we are all in a sense following Him and how important that is. So if one of us is kind of on the loose end, he might not be in our presence kind of thing.
Yeah.
So in that regard as well.
Yeah, and think about how much of God's presence is present in a church environment where, and of course this is the time of year, right? I just imagine the vast majority of churches in the U.S. have Christmas trees and they have, the manger and all that kind of stuff, and they're singing Christmas carols and they're thinking nothing of it. Although I would venture to say the pastors all know that Christmas is a pagan holiday, right? So I mean, think about that. Like, who does he hold accountable, and what does he tolerate? And is his presence willing? Is he willing to put his presence into an environment where the statutes and the commands and the morality and the righteousness of God are constantly being flouted? Yeah.
I often wonder about the 7 churches in Revelation, how he goes to the angel of that church. And he tells the angel of that church what he's displeased with. But I often wonder, if he's displeased with the angel, if he's displeased with the messenger, is he also saying it to the people as well?
Yeah, because it's, I mean, kind of like trickle down effect, right?
Yeah.
You're talking
But
to.
he does go to the head of that church.
Yeah, it
first.
says, say to the messenger of this
Mhm,
church.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess that's the same thing.
It is, because the whole point of that structure was that the representative of a church like Pergamus or Thyatira or whatever would take the letter from John and bring it back and share it with the leaders in the congregation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, sometimes God makes distinctions with individuals, and sometimes he treats them all as one unit. Again, like he said, that Phineas turned back his wrath from the entire congregation.
Yeah.
He didn't say he turned back my wrath from Joe. Right? It was the entire nation. He treated them as a whole. Then he continues on here in verse 12. Therefore say, behold, I give to him, meaning give to Phineas, my covenant of peace, and it shall be to him and his descendants after him a covenant of an everlasting priesthood, because he was zealous for his God and made atonement for the children of Israel. Again, looking at them as more of a unit. Now the name of Israel, of the Israelite who was killed, and who was killed with the Midianite woman, was Zimri the son of Salu, a leader of a father's house among the Simeonites. Now this is to me a point of interest, but I don't know whether or not there's a larger significance to what I'm going to point out right now. But what tribe was Phineas from? He was a Levite, and the guy he killed was from what tribe? Simeon. So is there any other story that we've already talked about in a different lesson where we have Simeon and Levi involved in something together? I know Kathy knows, because I can tell by the look on her face.
What's the answer?
Is
Joshua from Simeon?
He was
No.
Ephraim.
No, Ephraim.
Oh.
Go ahead, Kathy.
How about?
You don't want to be a know-it-all?
No,
Well, I mean, I can go on if you don't want to say.
they enacted revenge on behalf of their sister.
Dinah, right? So you guys remember back when, because we're generations, like Simeon and Levi are no longer alive, right?
Right.
But a lot of times in the Bible you hear names like Levi or Simeon or Judah being used to represent the entire tribe, right? Not necessarily referring to the individual person. But if we go back to the story of Simeon and Levi, do you remember it was when they were in the city of Shechem, around the city of Shechem, and the prince of Shechem fell in love with Dinah, their sister. And most people teach that they raped her, but as I pointed out, I don't think that's the case. I think that he defiled her in the sense that they had a premarital affair or sex before they were married. But he wanted to marry her, and so he went to the family. He said, he said to his dad, get them to let her marry me because I want to marry her. And so, what did Simeon and Levi do? Do you guys remember?
Yes.
What did they do?
He went in there. He told them that they had to be circumcised.
That's right. He said, "Hey, listen, why don't we strike an accord?" Captain Jack Sparrow. Let's strike an accord, and let's just intermarry, and we'll create like a better nation than either of us together. But in order to do that, you guys all need to be circumcised. And they're like, yeah, sure, let's do it. And while they were recovering, Simeon and Levi came in and killed everybody. Now go to Genesis 49. Because honestly, I think that this event in Israel's history where Phineas killed Zimri, I think it's connected in the larger story of Simeon and Levi. So Genesis 49, this is where Jacob is prophesying on his deathbed. Remember, he prophesies over each of his kids. Last week or whenever it was, we talked about how he prophesied over Judah, and he said the scepter shall not pass right, between his feet until Shiloh comes. So here's what he says about Simeon and Levi, Genesis 49. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Instruments of cruelty are in their dwelling place. Let not my soul enter their council. Let not my honor be united to their assembly. For in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they hamstrung an ox. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. Interesting stuff, right? Let me go to... my notes got messed up here for a second. So here's the question. That last verse, verse 7, where he says, I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. What does that mean? What was the fate of the tribe of Levi?
You mean like to be priests?
Yeah, that's part of it.
They don't get any land.
They're not going to get any land.
No land, right? So remember last week we talked about, let me just put this up. Last week we talked about in the kingdom, right, from Ezekiel 48, we saw the description of how the land was going to be divided up on the left-hand side there. Right? We see the Levites, they're going to be in the holy district. And if we look at the breakdown of what's in the holy district, we have the Levites portion, which is right next to, remember, the sons of Zadok in the kingdom are going to be ministering, living in and around and ministering the temple, and the rest of the Levites live right next door. And that's in the midst of the holy district. This is the payoff of the covenant of Levi. This is all the faithful Levitical priests over the generations get to live there. Right? But during the time of Joshua, when they went into the promised land, in fact, this was stated back in Leviticus, when God was describing the Levites, he said, I have separated the Levites. Because remember, every male that broke the womb of animal and human was to be God's. But God said, all right, I'm not going to make you give me your kids, so you can keep your firstborn. I'm just going to take the Levites. I'm going to redeem your firstborn children by taking the Levites to myself, and they're not going to get in the land, but they're going to be special to me because they're going to serve me as the priest of Israel. So they had no land inheritance, and the Levites lived everywhere. They lived everywhere in the land. If you go back to that statement in Genesis chapter 4, let me back up so I can see it myself. Not Genesis 4, I'm sorry, Genesis 49, verse 7, he says, I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. The scatter them in Israel is referring to how the Levites had no land inheritance and they lived throughout the entire kingdom within each tribe. Are you guys with me? Mm-hmm. So that means, if I'm right about this, then the phrase, I will divide them in Jacob, somehow refers to the tribe of Simeon. Now, in the kingdom, you can see that Simeon is down there below the holy district, as it goes Judah, the holy district, then Benjamin, and then Simeon right below the land that's going to be given to Benjamin. So in the kingdom, Simeon's going to have a land inheritance. But what about during the time of Joshua? Does anyone know what happened when they divvied up the land? What happened to the tribe of Simeon? What's interesting, in Deuteronomy 33, which we're not going to read, but Moses at the end of his time, he blessed all the tribes except Simeon. Doesn't mention them. He mentions Ephraim and Manasseh, right, the two tribes of Joseph. So he did talk about 12 tribes. Simeon's not there. Simeon's not there. Go to Joshua chapter 19. Joshua 19:1. I'll give you a second. It's like one of those books you don't go to very often, right? It's in there, I promise.
We're judges.
Right after Duke.
What's that?
Right after Duke.
Right after Duke. So Joshua 19:1. This is after they've defeated most of their enemies. And Joshua is now dividing the land among the different tribes, and they're doing it by lot. It says in Joshua 19:1, the second lot came out for Simeon, for the tribe of the children of Simeon, according to their families. And their inheritance was within the inheritance of the children of Judah. And then he goes down in the next few lists, and he lists the different cities. Go down to verse 9. The inheritance of the children of Simeon was included in the share of the children of Judah. For the share of the children of Judah was too much for them. Therefore, the children of Simeon had their inheritance within the inheritance of that people, meaning within the inheritance of Judah. So if you go back again to Genesis 49, sorry to keep making you go back there. Genesis 49:7, where he's talking about Jacob's prophecy of these two different tribes. When he says, I will divide them in Jacob, he's talking about how Simeon was absorbed by the tribe of Judah. And then when he says, I will scatter them in Israel, he's talking about how the Levites had no specific land inheritance. They lived everywhere. They lived throughout the entire kingdom, even though they were responsible on rotation eventually to go and serve in the temple. Pretty awesome, right? Pretty awesome stuff. What an incredibly detailed story God has given us. Now, go to Numbers chapter 27. Since we're not meeting next week, I might go a little long. You got to double up. I won't double up, I promise. Numbers 27, we're going to start in verse 12, but back in Numbers 26, God has the Jews take another census, and I think I mentioned this to Vera, I think it was Vera last time. In the second census, the number of the fighting men came out to be like 601,000, whereas the very first census back in the beginning of Numbers was 603,000 and change. So over the course of 40 years and all the battles that they fought and the people that died and the people that were born, they still had about 600,000 people when they were getting ready to go into the promised land. In Numbers 27, Moses passes the torch to Joshua. Verse 12, now the Lord said to Moses, go up into this Mount Abarim, and this is at the northeast end of the Dead Sea, across from the Jordan River, across from Jericho. So he says to Moses, go up into this Mount Abarim, see the land which I've given to the children of Israel. And when you've seen it, you also shall be gathered to your people as Aaron your brother was gathered. For in the wilderness of Zin, during the strife of the congregation, you rebelled against my command to hallow me at the waters before their eyes. These are the waters of Meribah at Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin. Then Moses spoke to the Lord, saying, let the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, set a man over the congregation who may go out before them and go in before them, who may lead them out and bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord may not be like sheep which have no shepherd. And the Lord said to Moses, take Joshua the son of Nun with you, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him. Set him before Eleazar the priest and before all the congregation, and inaugurate him in their sight. And you shall give some of your authority to him, that all the congregation of the children of Israel may be obedient. He shall stand before Eleazar the priest, who shall inquire before the Lord for him by the judgment of the Urim. At his word they shall go out, and at his word they shall come in, he and all the children of Israel with him, all the congregation. So Moses did as the Lord commanded him. He took Joshua and set him before Eleazar the priest and before all the congregation. And he laid his hands on him and inaugurated him just as the Lord commanded, by the hand of Moses. Right? So this is the beginning of the transition of authority. Here's the question, verse 21. He shall stand before Eleazar the prince, who shall inquire before the Lord for him by the judgment of the Urim. What does that mean? What is the Urim? Go to Exodus 28, verse 30. This is where God is giving them instructions on the garments of the priesthood. Exodus 28, verse 30. The priests actually wore several different layers. I've got a graphic up on the screen there. It's a partial screen capture. There's a little bit more on the graphic there. But in Exodus 28:30 it says, "And you shall put in the breastplate of judgment," right? So they had undergarments, and then they wore a robe. They had a turban that was like 22 feet long that they wrapped around their head, and then they wore this little golden crown on top of it. They had these things on their shoulders, and then they wore this breastplate, and inside or embedded in the breastplate were 12 stones, different kinds of stones that represented the different tribes. So in Exodus 28:30, "You shall put in the breastplate of judgment the Urim and the Thummim, and they shall be over Aaron's heart when he goes in before the Lord. So Aaron shall bear the judgment of the children of Israel over his heart before the Lord continually." So the Urim and the Thummim, the Septuagint calls them the symbols of clarity and truth. Symbols of clarity and truth. Now this graphic on the screen there, you guys probably can't read it, but let me read this. And this is, I put the word controversial up there, right? Because different commentators and different scholars have different opinions. But here it says the Urim and the Thummim is the divine name of God written on a piece of parchment. Its presence allowed for the divine guidance received by the illumination of the letters on stones. So some scholars, and I think some rabbis, modern rabbis talking about the history, suggested that in trying to figure out God's will, somehow the stones would light up in some kind of a pattern that would give them direction and guidance. Right? I don't know that that's true or accurate. It's certainly not spelled out in the Bible itself. One commentary says this: the Urim and the Thummim were probably two flat stones. One conjecture is that each was inscribed on each side with the words Urim and Thummim, and they are derived from Hebrew words that mean either curse or to be perfect. And when the stones were taken from the high priest's breastplate and thrown, and there's evidence of this in, for example, Leviticus 8:8. If both sides showed Urim, the answer was no, and if Thummim, the answer was yes. So this was kind of a way to divine what the will of God was in a certain circumstance. Here's an example, and I'm just going to read one sentence. This is 1 Samuel 28. Saul was faced with a decision to either go fight against the Philistines or not, and he wasn't sure he was going to win. So he wanted to know from God. And 1 Samuel 28:6 says, "And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him either by dreams or by Urim or by the prophets." Either way, whether the stones lit up or whether they kind of rolled them like dice, the two flat stones, or rolled them like dice, and whatever came up gave them an answer. This Urim and Thummim was apparently part of how God gave his people insight. It was delivered through the Levitical priesthood. Moses actually mentions these as well in part of his final blessing in Deuteronomy 33:8. Again, I'm just going to read one verse. He says, "And of Levi he said," and he's talking about the tribe of Levi because the man Levi is dead. Deuteronomy 33:8. "And of Levi he said, let your Thummim and your Urim be with your Holy One, whom you tested at Massah, and with whom you contended at the waters of Meribah." Cool stuff, right?
Yeah.
This is some of the terms. For some reason, some of the notes that I had written this morning are not in my file for whatever reason, but some scholars will use the term kleromancy. Kleromancy, and that's basically using. There's another word for it too. Sodification. Basically, it's using lots, like casting lots or throwing dice, to determine the will of God. Now, the assumption, and I think this is a good assumption simply because we see Moses talking about it, right? Saul sought the will of the Lord and went to the prophets who used the Urim and Thummim. So this was obviously part of the system of how God communicated. I don't think that this was something that they just made up. But if we can assume for the moment that this was part of how the Levites divined the will of God, the high priest would take these stones, whatever, and throw them down, and God would answer them. You know, yes, no, left, right,
Radio
up,
trains.
down, or yeah.
So
Right.
is it a precursor of the throwing of Lot?
Well, I think that this was. I mean, honestly, if you go read back through some of the commentary, other cultures did similar things. But there's only one nation that was authorized to do it and literally be divinely directed by God. But I think casting lots to divine fate and all that kind of stuff, I don't think that's unique to the Jews. That's probably an argument that a lot of people will say, well, everyone else did it, so the Bible doesn't mean
And Tim would say
anything.
it was invalid when they cast lots to pick the 12th disciple or the 12th apostle.
Right.
Well, that was different.
That was it.
Yeah, that was just
they
Peter.
like pick two and then say, all right, guys, pick one of those.
Yeah,
like,
yeah, that's a completely different scenario.
Yeah. So it's
Complete.
not always like a valid by God. Sometimes it's someone being presumptuous. or-
Yeah, well, I mean, New Testament, Old Testament, two
Yeah.
different, completely different paradigms, right?
Yeah.
But Moses himself, right? Moses saying, being the prophet of God, saying, with Levi, let your Urim and Thummim be with your holy ones, right? It's almost like he's saying, yeah, this is a legitimate thing. This is what we used to do. Now, go to Numbers 31. Chapters 28 to 30, Moses and we see a review of laws, a review of festivals. We're not too far off the end, guys. Just hang with me. Yeah, I had some other things in my notes this morning that I guess that didn't save. Some other things that I wanted to bring out. But we'll do our best to reconstruct here. So Numbers 31, throughout this time period, not just the 40 years, but even the time after Kadesh Barnea and after they kind of circled back around and Miriam died and then Aaron died, Moses continued to lead with Joshua being his protege. They continued to have wars. They fought many battles. They were in constant strife against Moab and Edom and Midian and Ammon. And what that means is that the second generation of Jews, that the ones that actually went into the Promised Land, were probably very seasoned warriors. There was a lot of them. And I think that that's going to be relevant to our discussion when we get to go into the book of Joshua and talk specifically about the Battle of Jericho and what that means. But in Numbers 31, verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take vengeance on the Midianites for the children of Israel. Afterwards, you shall be gathered to your people. Now he's telling Moses, hey, you're going to die too, just like Miriam, just like Aaron. So Moses spoke to the people, saying, arm some of yourselves for war. Let them go against the Midianites to take vengeance for the Lord on Midian. 1,000 from each tribe of all the tribes of Israel you shall send to the war. So there were recruited from the divisions of Israel 1,000 from each tribe, 12,000 armed for war. Then Moses sent them to war, 1,000 from each tribe. He sent them to war with Phinehas, the son of Eleazar the prince, with the holy articles and the signal trumpets in his hand. Now, we didn't talk about the signal trumpets, but remember that year that they were camped at the foot of Mount Sinai, and God was telling them to make all kinds of stuff? Well, as they were getting towards the end and they were getting ready to make the tabernacle and then consecrate that, he told Moses to make these silver trumpets. And these trumpets were used to call to war, but they were also used to simply signal to the people, hey, it's time to break camp and start moving, right? Whenever the cloud, the presence of God lifted and moved, then the priests were to blow a certain pattern on the trumpets, the same trumpets, and then everyone knew it was time to break camp. And then when the presence of God stopped, they would stop and they would set up camp, but it was also used to signal it's time to go to war. And all those instructions are back in the book of Leviticus and Exodus. So the silver trumpets, where was I? Verse 7. And they warred against the Midianites just as the Lord commanded Moses, and they killed all the males. They killed the kings of Midian with the rest of those who were killed. Evi, Rechem, Zur, Hur, and Reba, the 5 kings of Midian. Notice this, Balaam, the one who got all the Jews to play the harlot with the Moabite women, Balaam, the son of Beor, they also killed with the sword. So he got his in the end. And the children of Israel took the women of Midian captive with their little ones, and took as spoil all their cattle, their flocks, their goods. They burned up with fire all the cities where they dwelt and all their forts. And they took the spoil and all the booty of man and beast. Then they brought the captives, the booty and the spoil to Moses, to Eleazar, to the congregation of the children of Israel, to the camp in the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho. And Moses, Eleazar the priest, and all the leaders of the congregation went to meet them outside the camp. But Moses was angry with the officers of the army, with the captains over thousands and captains over hundreds who had come from the battle. And Moses said to them, "Have you kept all the women alive? Look, these women caused the children of Israel through the counsel of Balaam to trespass against the Lord in the incident of Peor. And there was a plague among the congregation of the Lord. Now therefore kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has not known a man intimately. But keep alive for yourselves all the young girls who have not known a man intimately." Now what distinctions is Moses making here, and why is he making them like this? Why, first of all, why was he angry?
Because he told him to kill the men, and they didn't.
Well, it says he killed all the men.
It was supposed to be total destruction.
But Moses let some people live, right? Who did he let live and why?
The virgin women.
The virgin women.
Yeah, just the virgin women.
Yeah.
Because he didn't want them procreate, basically. Because the reason they would kill them is because they were
Yeah.
children of the.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's, again, it's not really spelled out, right? But so we're left to speculate about certain things like, why would you leave a virgin woman? Why would you kill the male children? Right? Generational evil. Children tend to grow up to be like their parents. Right? And one of the biggest complaints
Men
that
are
not
supposed to be the head of the household.
what's that?
I said, and men are supposed to be the head of the household. So if they're the head and they're evil and not right, that's going to trickle down to the rest of the body,
Yeah.
the rest of the family.
Yeah, and this is, one of the biggest complaints and arguments that people who are non-believers use against the Bible, especially when they characterize the God of the Old Testament as being angry and wrathful, and who wants to serve a God who would kill babies and all that kind of stuff, right? And it's because of this tendency. Like, if we're talking about nations who sacrifice their own children to the demon gods that they serve, like, do you want to let that proliferate? Is that the kind of world that you want to live in? And so God was cleansing. I mean, it's not ethnic cleansing. It's purifying the land and the world that the Jews eventually would live in, right? The people of God. So whether it was, trying to stamp out generational evil, there was kind of like blood vengeance, right? He said, take vengeance on the Midianites. God was settling a score, if you will, because of how these other countries and these nations had influenced the Jews and caused them to be a harlot and to forsake the covenant that they were living under. And maybe to some degree he was setting the precedent for Joshua in the future, because what was Joshua's job?
Cleanse the land.
It was to cleanse the land. It was to go in and kick everybody out, one way or another.